Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this evening, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on YouTube, and an even more special welcome to those of you who are joining us on C-SPAN. Our subject tonight could not be timelier: the history of finance in American political campaigns. Money, of course, has been an integral part of American politics since the beginning of our nation, but today's massive campaign operations and super PACs are far more what the Founding Fathers saw in their day. Today, no serious study of history of finance in American political campaigns can be done without reliance on our records, and no single topic better illustrates the importance of the National Archives to our democracy. Congress has conducted important investigations of campaign finance practices. The lawmakers have passed major legislative reforms. The Supreme Court has handed down historic rulings on the constitutionality of campaign finance laws. All of this is documented in the critical records of our nation's attempt to grapple with the influence of money in our political life. Records in the National Archives document that. We're presenting tonight's program in partnership with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, and we thank them and their CEO, Pete Weichlein, for their support. Before we move on, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about two programs coming up soon in this auditorium. Next Thursday, on February 18th at 7 p.m., we'll present a program called Why Lincoln Still Matters, in commemoration of the 207th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln. A panel of scholars will share their personal reflections on the importance of the life and work of Lincoln for today's world. And from Wednesday, February 24th through Sunday, February 28th, we will present the 12th annual showcase of Academy Award nominated documentaries and short subjects. The National Archives hosts free screenings of the nominees in 4 categories: documentary, feature, documentary short subject, live action short film, and animated short film. The films are presented by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in partnership with the Charles Guggenheim Center for Documentary Film and the National Archives Foundation. There's a schedule on our website, archives.gov. Now it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage the Honorable Barbara Kennelly, the current president of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, who will introduce the panel. Barbara served 17 years in the House of Representatives, representing the 1st District of Connecticut. She was the first woman named Chief Deputy Majority Whip. She's the founder and president of her own advocacy organization and is a distinguished professor of political science at Trinity Washington University here in the district. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Kennelly.
Thank you, David, for again hosting us in this very marvelous building, a building which absolutely protects the history of the United States of America. We at the Association of Former Members of Congress, and David, I really want to say this to you again and again, we so appreciate the partnership that we have with the archives. It's resulted in numerous excellent discussions that have served to showcase pragmatic and serious deliberations across the political aisle. We are totally nonpartisan. And we can only hope that come November, this will bring us to a new time. Well, we used to have it for a long time, but a new time when the White House and the Congress get along. We can only hope. Before elections can be won, they have to be run. And these days, to run an election means one thing: to finance an election. Remember, the other night I was absolutely bemused when, after the New Hampshire primary, a panelist for CNN was asked if he thought John Kasich was going to be able to really give Jeb Bush a hard time for the establishment vote. And very casually, he just said, "Oh no, John Kasich cannot outraise Jeb Bush," end of story. And that's what we deal with these days, because money has become so pervasive in our political system. A great many individuals and organizations are now taking a great look at this whole situation. Our group that we're joining with tonight, partnership with the archives and with former members, is issue 1. And they are partners tonight in this tremendous, important conversation. And I thank you for coming, because this is really important to the future of our democratic system. Let me quote from their website. Issue 1 is a nonprofit organization committed to putting everyday citizens back in control of our democracy by reducing the influence of money over American politics and policy making. One of Issue 1's most important initiatives is the Reformers Caucus, a bipartisan group of 120 former members and governors working together to bring attention to this issue tonight. And I thank you, because I love seeing people that are interested in something that really could hurt our whole system. I am proud, and I am a proud member of the Reformers, very proud. And all the former members that you're going to see on the panel, they are part of establishing Issue 1 and being part of it. We are therefore in very knowledgeable and capable hands tonight for an in-depth and serious look at financing and political campaigns, and with which Issue 1's help, we've recruited an outstanding panel. And let me ask them to now join me on the stage, and you're going to help me welcoming them. Senator Bennett Johnson, a Democrat from Louisiana. Senator Bill Brock, a Republican from the great state of Tennessee. Ambassador Tim Romer, a Democrat from Indiana, who after his service in the House was our country's ambassador to India. And Meredith McGee, who is the policy director at the Campaign Legal Center in the areas of campaign finance, voting rights, political communication, and government ethics. Keeping things flowing and keeping these fine folks in order will be the job of our moderator, Jeff Sell, an American historian, a comic strip author, a writer for Bill Clinton when he was president, and then I was a partner of West Wing Writers. And David, I want to again thank you, because seriously, to have a place like the Archives, to have a program like this, and have the caliber of these panelists to be able to come and talk to you and discuss what's bothering us, the fact that money has taken over our elections, and we can't continue this way. So I thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks very much. First, I want to thank all of you for coming out on a very cold night. I want to thank the National Archives for hosting us, and Issue 1 and the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress for sponsoring the event. We're very lucky to have such a distinguished panel of former members of Congress here with us tonight, a group whose careers have spanned the pre-Buckley, the post-Buckley, the pre- and post-Citizens United eras. They've survived them all, and they'll be sharing their experiences and insights with us tonight. I want to thank Meredith McGee for being here as well. We'll be very glad to have your expertise on hand as we try to navigate the complex and changing landscape of campaign finance law. I'll have questions for each of you, of course, but we really want this to be a conversation. So if you want to jump in, any of you, at any time, I know members of Congress rarely need that sort of prompting. Robert's rules are not meant to apply tonight. And later, we'll be taking questions from the audience. And in the spirit of the subject of this evening, the microphones will go to the highest bidder. Let's begin, Meredith, if we could begin with you. We're marking, as we all know, I say marking, not celebrating, the 40th anniversary of the Buckley decision of the Supreme Court. I wonder the decision that equated spending with speech. And I wonder if you can walk us through Buckley, what it decided, and why it's been such an important decision.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'm going to spend just a minute as well kind of talking about how we got here, because I think it's important to see how this issue has developed. I could actually start back at the founding of the country and start talking about special interests and factions, but I don't think I'll go all the way back that far. I think you have to look at this through the scope of the last century, where you had from 1907 the corporate ban that was passed in the Roosevelt era in the aftermath of the scandals with the railroads, into the 40s, where the ban was on campaign contributions from labor union treasury funds, was passed in the aftermath of World War II and the steelworkers strike. Then you had, after that, the FICA that was passed in the aftermath of Watergate. And then you had a series of court cases. And of course, the one that everyone pays the most attention to is the Buckley decision. And what was very critical about that decision was this differentiation in terms of how the court interpreted the treatment of expenditures versus contributions. And it really kind of bifurcated the way those were treated under constitutional law, saying that in terms of expenditures, you could not put limits on expenditures for candidates. You could have independent expenditures, and it declared, in my view, somewhat ridiculously, that independent expenditures were not corrupting. So in other words, you could give a small contribution, small, of $2,000, that anything over that was corrupting, but if you spent $1 million in an independent expenditure, that was not corrupting. I think that somewhat begs reality. The Buckley decision also reached many other issues in terms of this notion of what is coordination versus what is independent spending. And it also looked at some of the areas about how you can get around some of the spending limits. So things like aggregate contribution limits, how much you can give to a party. That decision actually recognized that you could have the ability to give money to a party, and then that money would get given to candidates, and there were potentially corrupting influences in that exchange. The other kind of notable question here in terms of court jurisprudence was the notion that you could not exactly equate money with speech, but that obviously the ability to spend this money had free speech implications. And so it was really this kind of notable linking of First Amendment rights with the expenditure of money, which had really not been the jurisprudence and changed really more than 200 years of how this country looked at the linkage between speech and money. Now, I'm going to move very quickly just so where we got today. So after Buckley, you have Austin, the case of Austin versus Michigan Chamber of Commerce. The reason that's important is that they actually looked at the corporate contribution ban, and the ban on corporate contributions was upheld. And the philosophy on that was it had the ability to distort the process if you allowed corporations to tap their treasury funds. Then you move from Austin and you go to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which I know some of the folks up here I actually lobbied on that bill. And that was challenged in the McConnell v. FEC case. Very notable that the court upheld that. Of course, that court had Sandra Day O'Connor on it. But it had a very wide spread of what constituted corruption. And then, of course, after McConnell, we have Citizens United, in which corporate campaign contributions are permitted, followed by a case that most people don't pay attention to, Speech Now, which allowed super PACs to raise and spend unlimited money. And then the last court case, McCutcheon, in which the aggregate campaign contribution was thrown out by the court. The most important things in this, of course, are not only this differentiation between expenditures and contributions, but also the court saying that the only constitutional grounds to go and discuss these kinds of campaign limits are the grounds of corruption and the appearance of corruption. And so that's important because when you got to this last court case, the McCutcheon court case, the court basically, in the Roberts majority opinion, said, unless you have almost a quid pro quo agreement, then you really don't have corruption. And just a reminder, in the Kennedy decision in Citizens United, Mr. Kennedy wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, that seeing the buying and selling of influence will not create problems of undermining public confidence in the government. Whether you believe that or not, of course, is up to each of you individually. I know where I come down.
Well, and one of my questions that we'll get to for all of you is whether you believe that and what defines corruption. But before we get to that, Senator Brock, you, like Senator Johnston, were elected right around the time that Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1971, and you were in office for the Watergate-era reforms, the amendments to FECA, and then for the Buckley decision and beyond it. And I wonder if you can speak to the changes that you witnessed during your tenure there. How did it affect you as someone who was running for office on either side of some of those events, as someone who was trying to get something done in the Senate in between? Did you feel that money was playing a greater and greater role during that period?
I think my first race for the Senate, at least, was in 1970. And I don't think we thought much about it, to be honest with you. You could take cash, you could take checks. I never got any in kind. I'm not sure what that meant in those days. But the idea that money was sufficient to cause a serious corruption, I don't think most of us thought much about that until the Watergate. And then we began to read the story of people going to jail for violating, I guess it was the 70, was it 70? 71, well, yeah. You said, whoa, okay, then there's something going on. And after that, when the 74 limits were imposed, again, it didn't have any effect on me. I will remember, I do very well remember, though, one specific case in which we had an East Tennessee businessman up in the hills and hollers of East Tennessee. And he was used to tapping, I found out later, all of his suppliers to his company and said, if you want to do business with me, I want a piece of the business that we do together. And then he would turn around and give it to cash for whether it was a local, state, or national. And I went to see him because he was a political, not just a giver, he was an activist. And while I was there, he said, oh, I've got this envelope for you. And I said, Jack, I know what's in there, and I can't take it. He said, oh, these are newspaper clippings. I said, Jack. I said, I don't think so. He said, word of honor, Bill, you know you can trust me. Take it. I had these two guys with me, and we went out. We had driven about a mile. And I said, all right, I got to open this thing. And I opened it. It was just a huge stack of bills, not newspaper clippings. And I told one of my guys, I said, there are two cars behind us. We'll stop. You get out and you take it back. Because I'm not going to jail for whatever it was. I mean, I don't care whether 5,000 or whatever. I said, I'm not going to do it. He was just heartbroken because he'd been doing it all of his life. And all of a sudden, we began to see that the change of rules did change some things. Didn't work before we got to, Buckley was a different world, very different. But we were reacting with Buckley to this kind of thing and trying to see if there wasn't some way to make sure that if there was corruption, that we could stop it. And we could stop it by at least dealing with the contribution side, if not the expenditure side. That was the hope. And it sounded logical at the time. Shows you the law of unintended consequences.
Thank you. Senator Johnston, I wonder if you could speak to the same question. You were there for the same period of transition, and did you see a change? Did it become a greater concern to you, a greater concern to your constituents?
Yeah. Yes, I ran in 1972, which was the first year of the Federal Election Campaign Reform Act, which was the one declared unconstitutional in Buckley. And it was a very good act that restricted contributions, $1,000 per person per election. It restricted the amount you could spend by the size of your state. It really worked well. I mean, people don't remember that, but it worked very well. Rich people could spend only $40,000 of their own money. Then, in 1976, it was declared unconstitutional, and so from then on, we ran under, you know, unlimited expenditures. I was very, very concerned about it because you could see every year it got worse. I mean, it started off, they didn't know how to spend the money, but now they've got these huge combines that know exactly how to do opposition research, how to poll, how to do targeting of people. They spend up to, if you can believe this, in one House race, $100 million. It is so absurd. It has ruined the Senate as Bill Brock and I knew it. I was very concerned about it, and I was a committee chairman, had very bright staff, and so we said, what can we do about this? We're going to put in bills, and we researched up and down how we could solve the problem, given Buckley. That was before Citizens United. And we came to the conclusion that there was not much you could do. You remember McCain-Feingold, which I thought, you know, was an act which I voted for, which I thought was sort of a nothing burger, and even that was declared unconstitutional. So I'm absolutely convinced that the only one way to deal with expenditures and contributions and what has corrupted the whole system is to have either a constitutional amendment or a fifth vote on the Supreme Court. Citizens United was 5-4. And there are some other things that maybe you can do that will be, you know, marginally help. But you need a constitutional amendment. We ought to put it in now. Every candidate for president now has endorsed it. I was just reading yesterday. Bush says he'd eliminate Citizens United. Trump is, every speech he makes, he says, I don't want your money, I want your vote. And that's, I think that's most of his appeal. And you know Hillary and you know Bernie and all of them are for it. We ought to have a constitutional amendment, ask every candidate for president, are you for us or against us? You want to limit contributions? Do you want to deal with this issue? And do the same thing with members of Congress? And I think if we didn't pass it quickly, I think we could start a movement and a revolution. And believe me, I mean, Bernie Sanders talks about a revolution. We need a revolution in this issue now.
Well, and we'll do a little canvassing of the former members on this panel about a constitutional amendment and some other ideas. You indicated there are some other possibilities that might be pursued, and I'd like to get to those before we go to questions from the audience. Congressman Petrie, you were, I believe, the longest-serving member of Congress in this group, and you no doubt saw and were affected by the changing dynamics in Congress that are often lamented on both sides of the aisle, the sharp spike in partisanship, the dysfunction, the breakdown of what used to be, by all accounts, a very collegial group of folks. And I wonder how big a role you think money has played in that. There are a lot of things, I would imagine, that feed into this. But let's focus on the question in hand, and that is the role of money and campaign money.
Well, there's no question that over the period that I was there, increasingly in both parties, the leadership has been encouraging individual members to spend a lot of their time dialing for dollars, and that helps to determine to some significant degree your committee assignments and whether you're advanced to a chairman and that sort of thing. In the older days, seniority was king, pretty much. And so you didn't have to dial for, can you imagine some of these chairmen dialing for dollars or something of this sort? It's just absolutely impossible. They wouldn't do it. And I think myself, it has led to some of the dysfunction within the Congress because so many decisions are being funneled through the leadership rather than allowing a number of different centers of authority within the, I mean, these guys were old bulls that if you were chairman, you were pretty much regarded as ruling the roost, and Jamie Whitten was really the Secretary of Agriculture and so on and so forth. That's changed a lot. And I think one other point I'd just make on what Senator Johnson was saying, and that is leaving aside the court decisions. It seems, in my opinion, the Federal Election Commission is supposed to be administering some laws, and it's been very dysfunctional. It's deadlocked, and there are this business of independent expenditures or something of that sort is an area where they could be pretty aggressive, and you could cut back a lot of that or make it truly independent, and they're not really doing it. And so before we, or maybe as well as talking about amending the Constitution and replacing Supreme Court justices and all this sort of thing, whatever they do, it's been screwed up before, so they're not going to necessarily get it right the next time. It seems to me at least we ought to be trying to administer the laws that we have on the books effectively, and that's just not being done because there's political gridlock, they're not filling the positions, and candidates come in naively thinking they can file a complaint or someone was bribing some law. There's almost no, it's really law of the jungle out there so far as the elections are concerned.
Thank you. Ambassador Roemer, looking back at your time in the House, Congressman Petrie mentioned dialing for dollars. We're now familiar with this phenomenon. I'm sure you're very familiar with this phenomenon. Issue 1 tells us that members are now spending 50% of their day doing this and not doing the people's business. Can you talk about that constant pressure to be raising money, and how does it affect the other 50% of your day?
So I think that's a great question to start on. And here we have a Republican from the Midwest, a Republican from Tennessee, a Democrat from the great state of Louisiana, but deep South, a Midwesterner, all of us uniting and gathering together to encourage the people of our country to take back our democracy and demand the government that we deserve as people. And let's talk about how this money is impacting the electoral process, the governing process, and the recruitment of good candidates to run for Congress in the first place. And we're doing it in the appropriate place because here in the archives we have these sacred documents that have founded our country on the basis of equality for people and opportunity for people. Yet this system that has dominated, this big money and the billionaires and the 158 families that have provided half of the money for the campaign that we're going through right now, are determining not only who's going to win, but who will even run, who's even going to get in the race for Senate and House and the presidency. So I think this is one of the most fundamental questions that we face in this presidential year. Al-Qaeda is important. Our foreign policy and security is vital. Certainly inequality in America and opportunity for more people with jobs in the 21st century. But this issue of our democracy and who runs and how they represent our country is fundamental to solving all these other issues, climate change and education and security. So when I first ran in 1989, I knew to take on an incumbent who had been in office for 10 years. He had spent about $1 million before. I needed to raise $1 million through fish fries and hot dog suppers and individual contributions. But we both knew, the Republican that I ran against and me, we both knew roughly what we had to raise and spend. And then comes what Meredith just talked about, Buckley and other decisions, and the doors started to open up on independent expenditures, outside groups, things that could add into the contribution level, and you eventually saw members spending more and more and more of their time dialing for dollars, raising money. They're not attending their committee assignment. They're not talking to a Republican across the aisle to try to figure out how to balance the budget or deal with climate change. They're on their phone at the Democratic headquarters or the Republican headquarters raising money. 1, 2, 3, 4 hours a day. And so that not only impacts who will eventually want to run in our democracy, It impacts when you get to Washington, how you do your job, and who you do it with, and how you govern and sit in your committees and do the work of Congress. And then it impacts, on top of that as well, it impacts the kind of people that we're going to see running for president and where they spend their time and who they talk to. So I think, Jeff, this is just a critically important issue right now, and I'm delighted to see that there are people in the audience here that care about it, and we can talk about through the night here some of the solutions.
Great. Now, Meredith, you talked a little bit about the definition of corruption as it has evolved over the course of these Supreme Court decisions, and I bookmarked that to come back to it. I'm coming back to it now. Just to throw it open to the group, is the system corrupt? How do you define corruption? Is the Supreme Court indeed defining corruption too narrowly as only quid pro quo corruption, the kind that very rarely happens where there's a stack of Ben Franklins offered or newspaper clippings put into an envelope? Is that the only kind of corruption that concerns you, or should not only the rest of us, but our justices and our judges elsewhere?
Just one point.
Yeah.
There's a difference between individual corruption, people taking money, putting it in their own pocket, using it for personal purposes, and corruption of the process where you get sort of illegitimate decisions or people who are buying public policy. There's less individual corruption, in my opinion, in the Congress than there ever has been. I think people are personally, by and large, very honest and conscientious. We've not had one of these ab scams or anything like this for years. People are very concerned about this. But people raise money from people of business before their committees. And sometimes they're contributing because they don't want issues to be raised, as well as to get something done because they already have some provision there that they're trying to protect. And this it weakens the ability of the process of the system to improve the way that we're governed.
Yeah, actually, the way I think, people talk about corruption and the appearance of corruption. The form of the word I actually prefer is corrupting. And because it is a system in which, and I think I would recommend for those who haven't read it recently, a new book out by Richard Painter, who is the ethics counsel for President Bush, making a very persuasive case, again, on this issue that's very similar to what we are hearing from these former members. And really talking not only about this jurisprudence about corruption and the appearance of corruption, but I think what every American knows and what we're seeing reflected in this campaign, which is the preferential access and influence. That is, I think, there's no doubt at all that that's happening every day. A big donor gives, a big donor gets access, a big donor gets influence. And that means that if you're an average American, the chances that you have of having that same kind of preferential access are next to nil. Every once in a while, if you are from the home state, you may get an opportunity to meet with a senator or a representative. But this ability to actually be heard and to have influence. I think the most corrupting part of the system is this preferential access and influence.
So I would echo something that my friend Tim talked about. And I don't think that there are a bunch of members, Jeff, dialing for dollars and raising $5,000 and $10,000 and $15,000, $20,000 a day and sticking that money in their pocket. That's not the problem today. The problem is they start their day at 8 o'clock, not on Monday to go into session, usually on Tuesday. They may go to a committee assignment and then go to raise money 4 or 5 hours on Tuesday and have a couple votes. Wednesday, a little bit more fundraising and another fundraiser at night and maybe a little work. Thursday, they go home. And so much of that time that they should have been doing the people's business, working on the government problems, water in Flint, jobs and infrastructure projects, addressing the issues of affordability in higher education, they're not doing those things. They're instead talking to people that can afford to write 1,000 and a 5,000 and a 10,000 and at the presidential level, a $5 million check. And so instead of talking to that pipe fitter or that nurse or that teacher and hearing about how they're worried about their job, they're worried about their kid and how many jobs their kid might have in their lifetime, that member might be sitting on the phone listening to somebody on Wall Street talk about derivatives and something they need to do on legislation that may be coming up later. So is that a corrupting influence on the system? Is that insidious to our democracy? Is that unfair to the rest of the people in America? Yes. Yes, it is. That is not how our system's supposed to work. And I think that's what needs to be changed.
You know, I have such respect for my colleagues up here. I really don't like the word fair. I'm worried about what's happening to our country where people are. I want you to think about what it feels like to really care about some issue that affects you directly, or your family, or your community, or even your state. And you know. You just know. You don't have to see who's raising money, how many millions of dollars are given here and there. You know very well that the guy that gave $1,000 or $10,000 is going to get his phone call answered. The odds of you getting your phone call answered are zip. And what that does to you and your sense of what this country is all about, the genesis of it, the core of a self-governed body politic with representation, what that does to you when you look at that, I happen to think redistricting is at least as big a problem, if not more so, in what is done to divide the parties. But we are down to 1 out of 7 Americans voting in a primary, and most of their candidates are elected in primaries because we've cut an unholy deal between the two parties. You get the Democrats, I get the Republicans. We don't have to worry about the general. 1 out of 7 is voting in the primary. 14%. Who do you think votes in the primary? Forgive me, but nuts.
It's a technical term.
Ideologues, single issue people have a passion for a particular point of view, but it is not a broadly based look at the totality of my family, my children, my community. And if I honestly and truly can't see a way to having an impact, why do I vote? And if I don't vote, why do I trust the system? Okay, at that point, I might as well vote for a shouter. And that just scares me to death. I don't even call it corruption. I don't call it unfair. I just think it's an erosion of everything that this country stands for, that people could come to a conclusion that they don't have a voice because of the way things are operated. That just scares me to death.
You know, the American public gets this. I mean, this is not something we've discovered up here.
Yeah.
The polls show that over 80% of Americans think this system is rigged against them because of money and politics. So the time is right to change this system. You know, you say you can't pass a constitutional amendment, it's too hard. Well, I was there when we passed the Equal Rights Amendment for women's rights. I voted for it, but it was a highly controversial issue, but it still passed the Congress, and it almost passed through the states. That's a long story about the question of rescission and, how long you have to do it. But I believe this could be done, and if you can't do it, you can at least start the movement. I'll bet you if we ask how many of you would help or ring a doorbell or something to try to help this, I bet everybody would say, yeah, let's do it. And I think that's all across this country. The country's ready for it. When every presidential candidate says they're for changing the rules, and we don't even try to change it. We've got to try. We've got to try.
So, Senator Johnson, if I could just ask you a follow-up question, and really this is for all of you. The polls are very clear. I mean, you mentioned this number,
Right.
and we're seeing it across a whole lot of opinion polls, different methodologies, same result.
Right.
The numbers are up. in-
Democrats and Republicans.
Democrats and Republicans. Republicans feel just as strongly about this as Democrats. You're seeing that, as some of you have mentioned, manifesting itself in the primaries on both sides right now. There's a reason that all candidates are speaking to this across the board. So given that, why is reform such an uphill battle? Why is it so difficult to translate? This isn't this isn't even a 60-40 issue. If this is an 85-15 issue, maybe the 15 could even be persuaded if they spent some time thinking about it, hearing about it from the candidates and from elected officials. Why is reform such an uphill battle?
Well, first you got to try. We need to have a constitutional amendment put in. I've drafted one and given it to some of you. If you don't like that one, get another one. And let's get it. Go see somebody and say, would you introduce this? And then run some ads and have the questioners on the debates say, are you for such and such amendment? And if you're not, why not? If you think a constitutional amendment is not the right way to go, what's your solution? And believe me, I tried. I mean, we spent weeks with very smart staff trying to figure out a way, and we did. That was before Citizens United and McCutcheon. That was just Buckley. But I mean, it's so clear and simple. The amendment says the Congress may define and regulate contributions and expenditures. Very simple. That's at the core of this whole thing. And if you don't deal with that, you can't deal with expenditures and contributions, and that's the problem.
What if we could?
I'd
Yes,
just say that, but if you pass that and you turn it over to the Federal Election Commission, you're not accomplishing a whole lot.
No.
And if we can't even
This
run
is
the
a
Federal Election
constitutional
Commission under the existing, the Supreme Court has a difficult job. They're trying to balance competing freedoms that we have. And you can go all one way or another. Yeah. So they struck a balance. You can say, well, they were naive about politics and independent expenditures and one thing or another. But if it's not even being administered effectively, it seems to me that then to say, well, the system's not working, so we have to amend the Constitution,
So let me try to referee this a little bit. It's tough to do, and I think Bennett's right, and I think you're right. Yeah. I think we got to do both. We got to go after big, bold ideas to completely turn our system upside down and right side up, and we have to chip away. This is difficult because there is so much money dominating the system, it has paralyzed and frozen the system. We have a president who appointed me to a job I'm very grateful for, and who just gave a great talk in Springfield about reclaiming our politics and becoming more civil and cleaning up money out of the system and making it more fair. He has an executive order sitting on his desk and has had it there for many weeks to clean up how federal contractors do business with our own government, and to say to all federal contractors, you have to disclose who you give money to, because you're not going to win a contract based upon contributions. You're going to have to win it on merit. We need the president to sign that executive order and take a modest step forward to clean up our system. He can do that. I think he will do that. And this bipartisan group is encouraging him very strongly to take that action. And that will have an impact. We're talking about big ideas to reform the FEC, which is toothless, feckless, and worthless right now. They're not doing anything to enforce the laws of somebody breaks the law and takes an illegal contribution, nothing happens to that person because of the 3-3 split. 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, it's tied up forever. we're talking about jurisprudence solutions in this bipartisan group that we formed. 120 former Democrats and Republicans to overturn citizens, to consider and push a constitutional amendment, to get the candidates for president on record, to appoint, to actually interview their Supreme Court nominees and ask them, will you vote to overturn Buckley and Citizens United before they appoint them? So I think you have to start with success, chipping away at this corrosive and insidious system dominated by a mountain of money, and at the same time go after these bold ideas to completely change a system that is not representing the American people.
So I have a little bit of a different answer, not in terms of substance, but you asked the question why we have these polls that show one thing, and then we have no action. And to some degree, I can give you a one-word answer, two-word answer, and that would be Mitch McConnell. Senator McConnell has taken this issue on from a very personal standpoint. He has blocked most efforts to update the presidential public financing system to move forward. There was actually a vote in September of 2014 on a constitutional amendment to overturn Buckley and Citizens United. That was a 54-42 vote. Not one Republican voted for it, and so it was all a totally partisan split. So right now, when you go out and talk to the American people outside of Washington, the conversations you can have about money and politics are amazing. Everybody gets it. I can tell you as someone who is a registered lobbyist, you go up to the Hill and you try and talk to congressional Republicans, and essentially the door gets slammed in your face. Now, where we have had some success is, as Mr. Petri notes, is on FEC reform. We've worked very hard on a bill that's a bipartisan bill that has 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans to try and fix the Federal Election Commission. I will note that the 2 Republicans who bravely went on that bill got phone calls from their leadership saying, what the heck did you just do? So the party structure at the moment on the Republican side has taken the position that they believe speech is money, they oppose a constitutional amendment, they oppose other efforts to try and fix the system. Now, my hope is that what you're seeing in this election with Mr. Trump, with Mr. Sanders, with some of the other rhetoric we hear, that this dynamic is changing generally. It's an unsettled electorate. And I think you're going to see more resonance and salience of this issue. But there is like this, a total division between what you hear out in the countryside and what the polls show you and what you hear up on the Hill.
Well, I respectfully submit that things have fundamentally changed. Look, the Republican presidential candidates are supporting this. I mean, here's yesterday, Bush. That's what Trump is running on. Cruz has said this. Last time they had a vote up there, it was before all of these huge $10 million contributions. The public has changed. I mean, look at the polls. You think the leader of the Senate, if the American public is concerned about that, is going to be able to stop this? I mean, that would be like trying to hold back the tide. Things have changed. We need to try.
From your lips to God's ears.
I want to talk a little bit further about this idea of a constitutional amendment. And there are, Senator, as you mentioned, there are a number of ideas out there, including yours, and they are, I think, one of the most popular suggestions in terms of how to reckon with this massive problem. And there's an obvious appeal to thinking bold, as you suggested, Ambassador. But I wonder, for the sake of argument, if you might think about this historical analogy and see whether you think it applies at all here. As David mentioned, I wrote a book called Supreme Power about Franklin Roosevelt's court packing fight. And before President Roosevelt decided fatefully to pack the court, beginning in 1937, he spent actually a couple of years considering other approaches to deal with the obstacles that the Supreme Court was putting up to the New Deal. As you all know, the Supreme Court was striking down one New Deal program after another on a whole range of different constitutional grounds. And there was a movement in the country for a constitutional amendment of one kind or another, either stripping power away from the court, giving more power to Congress, clearly defining due process, a whole range of things. There was a lot of support. Roosevelt ultimately decided against it because he said, look, I think the problem is not the Constitution, the problem is the court. What can we do about this court? Now, of course, there's not a whole lot you can do about the court, and I don't think any of you would suggest packing it at this point. But do you think that applies, or is there something in the, well, let's talk about that.
Maybe.
We make some news tonight.
They vote right on overturning it.
But, you know, is there a problem in the Constitution that needs to be resolved in this manner, or do we need simply to wait for the next Supreme Court appointment, which is a
look,
frustrating thing to do?
To have a constitutional amendment pending and a debate going, and the questioners at these presidential debates talking about it, that affects the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court listens to the public. I mean, look at the Second Amendment. You know, when I came in the Senate, Second Amendment was considered to be only, you know, relating to militias. And through really political activism, they legitimized the subject, and the Supreme Court changed it. So the Supreme Court listens to the public, and they will listen to this. I mean, they've been pretty tone deaf in not being able to see what this has done to the country and to the Congress and the Senate and the presidency, but they will eventually. So it goes hand in glove there.
So one of the things I think, Jeff, the answer to your question is we tend in Washington to concentrate on Washington. It's what we know, it's where we've worked. But the great news about reform is not only that we now have presidential candidates talking about the political process being broken, which leads to the economic inequalities in our country, but we also have states across the country, 25 states, I believe, who have taken this issue on to reform their own states, cleaning up lobbying and trying to cleave the connection between lobbyists and lobbyists directly giving to a legislator. They've done that in South Carolina. The South Carolina Supreme Court has affirmed that as a legal action and law. San Francisco, Seattle, Maine, all passing legislation at the local and state level, and Republicans can't object to this, right? This is states' rights. These are the people at the grassroots acting to empower small donors to do more, to give at the local level. They are doing more at the state level and the local level to address, as I said before, some of the inequalities in the financial system, in the campaign system. So when you see this movement from Arkansas and Montana and Idaho and California across to Maine, that does a couple things. That puts pressure on members of Congress to pay more attention. So to Meredith's point, you go in and you meet with a Republican member of Congress and you say, look, your state just passed all these reforms at the local level. What's wrong with doing this at the federal level? That's a pretty compelling argument, a states' right argument at the federal level to do something common sense. And then to the point that I think on a constitutional amendment, that can build support at the state level where you're going to eventually have to have support to get a certain number of the states to be in favor of this too. So again, back to what I said, you have to fight like hell to chip away and do the FEC reform, the federal contracting reform, make Congress accountable and do more, shame them into this if they're not convinced on the arguments of it, and do this national effort to address the states taking this on and a constitutional amendment. Together, I think that will take our system back. Now, will it be done next year? No. 2 years? No. 3 or 4 years? I think we got a shot. I think we got
it's
a
faster
legitimate
than that.
opportunity in 3 or 4 years to do this and reclaim our government.
I really don't believe it would take that long. I mean, people say, oh, look at the history of constitutional amendments. Things have changed in this country. The public is on fire on this issue. Look at what's going on. Look at the debates. Watch Trump. He says, I don't want your money, I want your vote. And everybody says, he's going to take it back from the people who have this country rigged. You know, believe me.
Well, before we go to the audience here, which
I
yes,
want to
Senator.
comment just for a second. I'm the old dog in this group up here. And if there's one thing I have learned is that every time you do something legislatively, there are unintended consequences. Buckley was a response to a perceived need, had an unintended consequence. We're really good at saying we can fix something here. The thing that attracts me about what Tim was talking about is that if you do believe that representative government works, I guarantee you it works best at the local level where you can talk to your mayor or your county office person or your state legislator. It works second best at the state level, the county and then state. And probably least best, if we daily prove up here in Washington. If you want to see change, and this goes back to the question of how do you get it there, I think you do have to start at that local and state level. Then you begin to address the hazard of that unintended consequence, because the genius of the federal system is we got 50 states, some of them making a mess out of things, and some of them doing it right. We learn from each other. Then you begin to build a logic behind your case. But I'll tell you, if you start coming top down, if you make it partisan, if you make it a national demand, you're on a risk. I fully believe there's ample evidence that when the people of this country begin to move in a direction, the court does listen. It does affect what they do. We had a very close vote on citizens. One vote made the difference. I'm not sure that that vote would have been there had we had something going a year or two before that that really said, this is important to us.
Congressman, do you want to jump in? And any of you who have questions, if you want to line up by the mics in the aisles there, then we'll alternate sides and take your questions.
Yeah, and I'd just say that not only starting at the state level, but we do have, fortunately, a fairly open process. And individuals can, and we're seeing it in this presidential campaign. I mean, can you imagine a candidate going on TV in his speech, and the next day is 6
million.
million 500,000. Now, would his opponent have been able to raise that much by saying, send me some money? Because the perception was that she's already got the big bucks. And Trump is getting a lot of support, partly because he's busy saying, I don't want your money. And people are and the purpose of all this money at the end of the day is votes. I mean, money doesn't directly vote. And if individuals take control of the process themselves and take responsibility and support candidates that are expressing views that they agree with, even small contributions can make a big difference over time.
It looks like we have a question right here.
I was wondering what you thought of the idea where instead of limiting the money, instead having the money matched on the other side, allowing an idea that might have had no traction to be put out there, but at least an even discussion of it.
I'd be having, what's to the point that Mr. Romer was saying, there are actually a number of places where the matching system has worked and worked well. New York City, for example, has a very robust matching system. Seattle has done something a little different, not exactly a matching system, but a voucher system in which they are sending $100 to every registered voter, and then they're going to be able to give that money to the candidate of their choice. You have a number of times where for 30 years, actually, the presidential system, which was a voluntary system, had a matching system that worked very well. So I think there are a lot of answers here that can be done in the meantime. One of my political concerns with the constitutional amendment, and this is not, there's a whole different substantive question, is it's a very easy answer for politicians. Well, what do you want to do? Well, I'm for a constitutional amendment. End of story. I actually like to see people that are put to the test. Are you going to support this legislation to reform the FEC? Are you going to support a system of matching of small donors? I want to get these guys and make sure that there's an opportunity to not just make a general statement, but to actually move forward and make some of these changes. There are actually changes that can be made in the House or Senate rules about what money sitting senators or sitting representatives could accept that don't even have to go through the whole legislative process, in addition to the executive order. So I think a matching system, particularly a robust, small donor matching system, would do one really important change, and that is change the incentives. Right now, the incentives for the candidates are to pursue the big dollars, and there are zero incentives for an individual to give a small dollar contribution because you feel like the big ones are going to really just make you drowned out. So I think it's a very important system that's being tried all around the country.
Well, I'd say these are good systems and they're great. The problem is that you get matched, you know, you make the pledge, I'm only going to accept small contributions, and that's matched. But your opponent, because of the Buckley and other decisions, can spend unlimited amounts. You can't deal with him if you were both playing by the same rule.
I wasn't talking about matching the money that was put in. I'm talking about matching the other side. If someone puts in $100,000, then the public money matches against the $100,000 they put in, so that they, so you have an even battle on the money.
That's one of
The court has actually struck down that system.
Yeah.
It was in Arizona. There's a
Yes.
course with Davis, and so the court said that that was not constitutional.
That's one of the
So-
things, when I was
But as
working
a
on
way
the
of
solution,
overruling it.
it's a good idea. We worked on that and figured out it was not constitutional.
Thank you. We've got a gentleman over here. You want to jump in?
Sure. So I actually worked for Congressman Romer's successor in North Central Indiana, or one of his successors, to be clear, Joe Donnelly.
great guy.
Now Senator Joe Donnelly. Yeah. For 3 years. And so I want a slight tweak on 2 points. One is a slight tweak. Joe Donnelly was the most accessible guy I knew. We took meetings. We went to events. We did Congress on Your Corner with like 3-4 people would show up. We would meet.
That's no reflection on Joe, right?
Yeah, no, he's hilarious. He maybe a little bit better looking would have gotten more. But no, great guy. But that's probably still the case today. I'm sure Congresswoman Walorski is having the same thing. Congressman Petrie, I'm sure you saw the same thing. So to a certain extent, I don't think it's a question of access. I think, I forget who this quote comes from. I think thinking about the challenge, this is the challenge I see, which is someone said, organized greed will beat disorganized democracy every time. And I think that's really, the name that hasn't come up here is actually my dad's classmates from MIT, which is the Koch brothers. But if you're a Republican, you can maybe talk about Soros like my brother does. So, that challenge, thinking about the challenge, I think is important. And the access is there if people will take it. But in my role working in South Bend, Indiana, I think I met probably 5,000 people in 3 years. I had one person come to us who had a request that was not purely self-interested or ideological. One person said, "This is a good idea that I see in the tax code." He was a tax professor, an accountant. And then the second thing is, just as a point, is I think to a certain extent we've created a problem for business too, and I think this gets undercommented. So I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on this. One, I love capitalism, but corporations have a fiduciary obligation to maximize shareholder wealth, or a lot of people argue they do. Two, they now can spend unlimited money in elections. So three, corporations and their officers now have an obligation to corrupt democracy. They have an obligation to spend as much money in our government as will maximize their wealth, their net present value. And so I'm curious to hear what people think about not only a problem for government, which we talk about a lot in DC, but a problem I'm sure people talk about in boardrooms is are they obligated to spend money? How do they spend that money?
So let me jump on the first part of your question because you asked it about Indiana and my hometown and my home district. I used to do the same things that Joe did. Garbage can turkey roast in Wanata, Indiana, where we'd get 40 people to come on a Sunday afternoon so they'd get access to their congressman. We did that all over the district, and Joe does that. And you mentioned that now Congresswoman Walorski is doing it. Why do they do that? One of the reasons they do that is probably they're smart politicians and good public servants, both Democrats and Republicans. But the other key reason we all do that is because that is one of the few competitive congressional districts left in America. We have a system, and this is going back to Senator Bill Brock's point, where instead of having 435 people fight for their districts and talk to their people and listen, Charlie Cook now, I think, estimates that there are about 25 out of 435 really competitive races in America.
Less than 50, yeah, for sure.
Somewhere between 25 and 50, maybe 25 that are really toss-ups. How can that be in our great democracy that you have 350 people that don't even have to go and meet with their constituents? And then they come back here to Washington and they raise money. They don't raise money for their election. They raise money for their chairmanship. They raise money for their leadership PAC. They raise money for the RNC and the DNC. So then that accumulates all this money that oftentimes puts other priorities in the queue legislatively, and maybe not that person that Joe Donnelly or Tim Romer or Jackie Walorski met with to do something to make higher education more affordable. That kind of falls down the line. So it's this corrosive system, redistricting and money, that has led to a democracy that is dysfunctional and deadlocked right now. Yeah. And, you know, I hate to say this, but we get the government we deserve. The people of America get the government they deserve. And until we rally up and revolt and take this government back, we're not going to change it. Whether it's a constitutional amendment or whether it's a FEC reform, the American people really have to take this 75 or 80% frustration rate. I'm mad as hell, but are you going to do something about it? That's the key right now.
And I think you've raised a very important point, and that is the impact of the current system on two issues. Business, as a general rule, the Committee for Economic Development, which represents the Fortune 500 companies, has come out with very strong statements talking about how the system has turned into a legalized shakedown from their perspective. Yeah. And the second is our national defense. I wish Mr. Hagel perhaps was here. He talks about how this special interest system results in expenditures on the defense side for things that the folks in the Pentagon don't even want.
That's right.
And so, you know, this is a system that's not, I think too often, you know, there's a notion that talk about this money in politics as kind of a progressive or a liberal issue. That's why I'm so pleased to see this group that Issue 1 has put together, because it shows that this isn't a right or left issue. This is about how you think democracy should work. There have actually been studies that have looked at some of the states that have adopted some of these matching and systems in public financing. Guess what they find? It's not a Republican or a Democratic system. It's just a different kind of system. And the business community is suffering. Our national defense is suffering because of the current system.
Just one point, too, on what Tim was saying. And we talk about all these districts being safe and only 30 or 50 being competitive, and yet there's tremendous turnover. The majority of the senators are in their first year, or were until very recently. The average member of the House only serves 3 or 4 terms.
All kinds of retirements.
And you say, well, how can it be if they have all safe seats and so on and so forth? Well, a lot of them quit once they get into the system, and they go in with the best of intentions, and they're honest people, and they're trying to make a difference, and they end up being pushed into this system where they're basically dialing the dollars in hopes of being effective, and this is not why I got into this, and they leave. So you have a tendency, a lot of really able people, but higher education levels and all the rest in the Congress than ever in our history, supposedly. But I don't know about practical education, because some of these guys had pretty good practical education. And yet, we have tremendous turnover because of the way this incentives within,
Nobody
once
enjoys
you
their job.
get into
They
the
don't like
system.
it.
Yeah.
But, you know, please, anybody that is watching this, thinking about it, don't start saying that the system is corrupt in terms of how its effect on people. It doesn't work. It's dysfunctional. But I'm going to tell you, in my life experience, and I'll guarantee you there's no disagreement up here, the huge, overwhelming majority of members of Congress are good, honest, caring, committed, patriotic people who are there because they wanted to make a difference. And they leave town because it's really hard to make a difference when the system is in deadlock. It's not just money, it is redistricting, it's a whole range of issues, but we got to deal with one issue at a time. You can't solve them all. Start with this, or go home and say, for God's sake, look what California, the Midwest, Florida, others are doing on districting. Look at the states that are doing things on finance. Let's try it here in Tennessee or Arkansas, Ohio. And we learn from each other. And then you can begin to create this movement that says, we're going to take the country back. It's a great way to put it. But we're going to give ourselves a voice again. And we've lost our voice. We feel the loss of that voice. And it scares us, all of us.
Can we take one more question here? Got a couple more, actually.
Okay, thank you. I'll just play devil's advocate here. Why not? So, Ambassador Romer, you said that the system is corrosive and insidious, but hasn't the system always been corrosive and insidious? I mean, this isn't. It's not like before Buckley, it was like Narnia, and people were, everything was good. I mean, you had the Hearsts before that running politics, and so, I mean, there was still access by a limited few. It was just a different limited few. So if money isn't free speech, then how do you ensure equal access to information for equal parties? And yeah, I'll just leave it there.
So I think that's a very good question and a very fair question.
You bet.
I would say, first of all, that maybe there's always been the potential in this system that has increasingly been about raising money and members spending more time doing it, that the possibility of this gridlock and insidious system would come about. But now, because of complicated decisions like Buckley, like Citizens United, like McCutcheon, it has opened up such a tsunami of money in all parts of the system. Plus, you have the redistricting problem where state legislatures are carving out safe seats for 80% of the members of Congress on the House side. And they don't have to legislate. They don't have to work on your problems. All they got to do is keep a primary from taking place. And so you have that problem layered onto this. In addition, because of these complicated Supreme Court cases, now at the presidential level, you have very wealthy Americans that can write a single check to a single candidate and keep them in at Iowa, at New Hampshire, at South Carolina, into Michigan. They don't have to go out and convince all of you in this room to vote for them and give them money. All they have to do is get one person to bankroll them now, and they are a voice out there, sometimes for good, sometimes for not so good. And so you've got all these cascading influences out there that have happened at the same time that I think have really collided to create a system that does not allow generally the American average citizen to have the voice that Jefferson and Washington and Adams and our founders said was an equal opportunity system for voting and accessing the system. It's not working.
If we could just pause on super PACs for a moment, if you can bear it. Is there anything that can be done short of a constitutional amendment to put the super PAC genie back in the bottle?
There are a number of things that can be done that I think would certainly change their role. One of the most ludicrous parts of the current system are these candidate-centric super PACs, right? I think people remember Mitt Romney talking about my super PAC. The whole notion, when the court talked about this, was this notion of being wholly or totally independent. Well, that's a farce. So that's actually partly at the door of the Federal Election Commission.
That's exactly
They could come in with reasonable, rational rules about what constitutes independence. And so that's just a starting place there to say, you know, we've had independent expenditures, people forget that, since Buckley. And they weren't very effective for the most part because you often had this lack of coordination. The messaging was often not right. Well, now you have them working hand in glove. That's fixable. There's also other ways, the dark money groups, oh my goodness. You know, this is an IRS problem. The IRS has said as long as you don't spend more than 50% of your money on political activity, you're a social welfare organization. Well, that's ridiculous. These are very fixable problems. They're not going to go ahead and, and I think this is where Mr. Romer hits the nail on the head. You always have to think in politics in two tracks. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. My experience of 30 years of politics is that most of the consequences are in fact intended. It's just nobody knew exactly and was paying attention. I think there's so much that can be done even right now, this Congress, and certainly on super PACs. The FEC could move tomorrow if it had an effective commission that was working.
Thanks.
Let me just say one thing about independence. We had an election down in Louisiana not too long ago, and one of the candidates was in a wreck on the day before election with a woman. It was no sex involved, but she happened to be the chairman of his super PAC.
But no coordination.
I'm sure they weren't coordinating.
They were just, it was a cup of coffee.
Yes.
I'm curious, between the Senate being a 6-year term and the House being a 2-year term, how much relative pressure there is on House members to raise money versus senators. And there's countries like the Philippines that have a 3-year term for the House. And so this reduces a little bit of the pressure for fundraising for races that are 50% more time between terms. As I understand it, Jimmy Carter, after he left the presidency, thought that maybe the presidency should have one 6-year term. What do you guys think of those ideas?
Those of us who are on the other side of that equation would have argued strenuously against that. We fought an election, took care of that.
Before
I don't know.
Buckley, senators generally would raise their money in the year before election. And the other 5 of the 6-year term, they would tend to their business and that sort of thing. And House members it wasn't as bad with House members either. Now senators raise money all 6 years, and they do it morning, noon, and night, weekend. I mean, these guys do not do the job. They are raising money, and they're traveling all over the country to do it. And it's, I think it's scandalous how little time they spend learning their job.
And think about it, and not in the House, if all the seats are safe, and all you're worrying about is a primary except in 50 seats, where is all the money going? Primaries usually aren't that expensive, especially if you can avoid them somehow.
Well,
But part of it, they
it's going to
raise
scare
money
off
so as to look frightening, so people won't run against them. Part of it is that they raise money and then contribute half or 2/3 of it to other candidates or to the party or to the House Republican or Democratic campaign committee. Not really on their own campaigns at all. Many districts in the country, partly because they're safe or because they're rural and some don't have TV stations even in them, you still have to advertise, but the costs are much less in rural areas than obviously if you're in New York or Connecticut or someplace like that. The actual money in most races isn't that much.
But the broadcasters are making out like bandits. Let's be
Yeah.
very clear. I mean, they're really the best beneficiaries.
You want to make a lot of money in America today? Buy a radio and TV station in Iowa and New Hampshire and just wait for the onslaught of money to be spent in the primaries and then the
Okay.
presidential race.
And then shoot yourself if you're looking at the tube.
All the negatives.
You know. Can I?
Sir.
One word was mentioned here that hadn't been mentioned before, and that's party. I don't know if I'm accurate. You're the expert, but aren't there limits on the parties now?
There are limits on what can be contributed to the parties.
Okay. Now think about this issue with primaries. Think about what California is trying to do with the winner-take-all primary, where they say, you know, the top two people in a general primary run against each other. It can be two Democrats, two Republicans, whatever. But the idea is that by doing it that way, they're going to force those two to compete for the center, where most of us are. Think about that in terms of what if we took the limit off of parties? Because then the parties' function is to win elections. They're going to not be supporting people in a primary. They better not get into a primary. They're going to be in real trouble. Their purpose has to be try to get some districting reform, yeah, okay, but try to get people elected by competing for the majority of the public, not the 1 out of 7 votes that's in a primary. We again have an unintended or perverse impact by limiting party and putting unlimited money. We've replaced our two parties with PACs. We're crazy. Nobody controls the PACs. And it just is so upside down what we've got. It's crazy.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience.
Sorry.
I have been really interested in Issue 1 and the Campaign Legal Center because, among other things, you're very positive. I really appreciate that you're focusing on a lot of concrete steps that can actually be done now. And I think that's really important. So one question I had is, if you could only pick one thing that you would urge people to really lobby members of Congress on that you think would have the best shot of being accomplished, what would that be?
Well, you know where I stand.
You know, actually, I think if we were talking short term, which I often think about, the first place I would go, other than trying to get the FEC to do something, that's a different question, is actually this question about the connection between lobbyists and bundling and the role that they play, that this kind of unholy alliance that kind of where you have the lobbyist that's coming and representing those that are giving a lot of the money. You have this kind of ability for the lobbyists not just to give themselves. That's kind of not the real issue here. It's about this ability to organize the money and get credit for the money and then to come to the Congress. And everybody knows that if you're the lobbyist who's organized all this money, you're getting in the door. That's a very fixable problem, actually, and fairly simple legislatively to do. And to me, it just begins, I think lobbying is a very honorable profession. I've been a registered lobbyist since 1987. I happen to never have given a campaign contribution in my life. But what's happened in Washington is that you've got this kind of combustible cocktail in which the lobbying community, the kind of billionaires, the special interests, all kind of get in bed together and then be able to go up and influence what goes on in Washington. To me, if that's the first line that you could draw, that would at least begin to change a little bit of how the town works. I don't know, maybe you guys have a
I
different
disagree with that, but I think it may be really hard to get done in the short term. I'm with Tom. I really believe that we have an opportunity to address a lot of issues with a reform of the FEC, to put the burden on them to be responsible, knock the deadlock off, and get with some specific actions that would address the very tangible problem. We're all good at defining a problem. It's really easy to see the problem, but putting those people in a position to affect the change, they're there. Make it possible.
I would say two things, but they're connected, and they're doable, and they're achievable in the next few weeks or several weeks. When John Kennedy was president, there was a poll done, and the American people were asked, do you believe that government can be a positive force in your life? And I think something like 75% of Americans said, yeah, I do. Whether it's a post office or veterans or, something in government, yes, can be positive. Today, especially with our young people and our millennials, that's upside down. Mm-hmm. Nobody believes at the national level, some people believe at the local and state level, government can be a positive force. That is depressing to see that. So my focus initially, in order to build momentum, show confidence that we can start moving this, show the reformer community that we can get some wins, it would be two parts. One would be, let's all encourage President Obama to sign this executive order and clean up federal contracting so that there's a bright flashlight, sunshine on this process. Every federal contractor that does business with our government, they need to disclose who they're giving business to. I think we can do that. Secondly, coming back to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, you break the law when you're running for Congress and you take illegal contributions or you break, a limit, if there is a limit, you should pay a price for that. And right now, literally nothing happens to anybody. Congress, in fact, uses the FEC as a political tool to almost accuse people in campaign commercials of doing something wrong because they know nothing will ever happen. So if we can reform the FEC and get Congress to pass a bill to change the demographics there, maybe it rotates 4 Democrats, 3 Republicans, depending upon who's president. It's never deadlocked 3-3. They're independent people appointed. That could do a lot to change the way that there's teeth in our election system and the way it's enforced. And then you build from there. You start going to the states, and the states are encouraged to keep up their reforms. You see jurisprudence efforts, whether that's a new Supreme Court or a few new Supreme Court members, a constitutional amendment that you could be working on at the same time. That's the kind of momentum we need to see from the American people on this.
I'd say there's no silver bullet in all this, but functioning FEC is at least we should expect. And then secondly, I've always thought it's a good idea. Elections do cost money. Someone's got to pay it. You can diminish the role of large contributions if you encourage small contributions, as we're seeing in the presidential race right now. It's an even contest. And so I've introduced legislation when I was in Congress year after year to go back to the system we had before these latest reforms to give people a tax credit for small contributions, a couple $100 or whatever, so it won't cost you anything if you're interested, or a tax deduction for a little larger contributions. I think if people give a contribution, it's like buying a lottery ticket a little bit, you'll start following it more and get more involved, and the whole purpose of all this is citizen involvement and a system that is responsive to the average citizen. But the average citizen has a responsibility too, and that is to understand that you don't just get rights, you have to have some responsibility, and we should try to encourage, not set up barriers to people participating.
Any closing statements from the rest of the panel before we
We got to do something to create a sense that it can be done. You need some early wins, some very short victories that people can say, oh, I believe it's possible. Once people begin to get a little bit of an up to this conversation, it'll happen.
Can I just say one short thing? Having traveled a lot around the world, you look at somebody like Nelson Mandela. He spent 27 years in a prison in South Africa. And one of the things that sustained him was the fact that when he got out, he wanted to bring democracy to his people. And he held up America as the standard for that democracy in the world, that we were that beacon of hope to every other country. And what we had, he wanted for freedom and equality for his people. Sadly today, when you travel around the world, you start to hear from people, hey, you know what? America is becoming a lot more like the rest of the world. You don't have competitive elections. You have money swirling all over your system. You have a corrosive and insidious deadlocked system that doesn't get much done. We need to address this. We need to take this democracy back, and you can do it. People are listening to this argument now. It is fundamentally changed. And I think if we don't use terminology like Buckley and Citizens United, and we talk about our democracy and our founders and equality for all people and the voice of our citizens, and that our democracy is at stake, I think this is going to turn. I really believe that there's a positive wave coming in America to take back this government.
Last comment?
My last comment is I actually think our democracy is both robust and fragile at the same time. You know, my father left his high school, I think at age 17, to go fight in World War II because of the threat to our nation. And I remember taking my niece one time to the Holocaust Museum, and we were going through, and we saw all the story of that, and they saw that, you know, in Germany, actually, Adolf Hitler came to power through elections. They were stunned. They had no clue. Every time we think about our democracy, I think Mr. Romer hit this nail on the head. We get the democracy we deserve. But I think a lot of us take it for granted. Oh, it's always been there. Yeah, we had problems before, but, you know, we've always stuck it out. I think it's much more fragile than that. And I think we really, as a nation and as a people, can't assume just because we've had 200 plus years of a democracy that we're entitled in some way to 200 more. And if we aren't careful with what happens and the way the system actually works, these kind of very basic issues about democracy, we're going to lose it. And we're going to think, what the heck happened here? And so I really think that this is the time. I think Senator Johnson hits the nail on the head. There is a wave, and now is the moment to catch that wave. And if we don't, I think we lose it at our own peril.
Grover Norquist, most of you have heard of him, has a pledge that people say, have members sign about taxes. And they all sign or they refuse to sign, and it's a big political issue. We need to make campaign finance and expenditures a political issue like that. The way to do it is to put in a constitutional amendment, and you ask a member, are you for limiting contributions by giving the power to the Congress to legislate or not? And it could be a powerful way to mobilize the public. You know, I'm for all these little things that we would do, you know, the FEC, this bill, or people haven't heard of the FEC, but they'd probably support you. But that's not the way to get a mobilized force going, which is what we need to do. And the way to do that is with the constitutional amendment, and I ask people, yes or no, are you for it?
Well, let that be the last word. Thanks to all of you for sharing your experience, your passion about this. Thank you, and thanks to all of you. Good night.
Thank you for doing this.